So, on the note of behavioral science, let's imagine that you and I just walked outside right now onto the street and we took a walk together. You and I were walking together, we're walking by a bunch of people, and you know, New York has a lot of diverse people, and let's imagine that we just took a sample of 20 people who might have walked past us and maybe even made eye contact with me. Now, your job is to take them aside and ask them a very simple question. Try to predict what kind of life this person had. And at this point, they're kind of on the spot. All they have is like this momentary memory of me as an Asian American female walking down the street of New York. Maybe there's a photo, they look at it, and at this point, they really have nothing to base their predictions on except prevailing narratives about Asians in America. And so now we enter the model minority myth. And what would the model minority myth say about me? Or anyone here who kind of looks like me? It would say something along the lines of, was probably from Jersey or LA. I grew up well off in a family. My parents immigrated in the 80s as highly educated professionals, and they probably wanted me to be a doctor, but maybe I wanted to be a photographer, and we had a little scuffle, but it all worked out. It was pre-med, and on my way to being a doctor, that sort of thing. And of course, I never would have faced any real racism. I mean, apart from the microaggressions of like, where are you really from? And so that would kind of be the story. And what I want to do is pause here and say, it doesn't matter whether or not the story is true about me or anybody else in here. The point that I want to make here is the danger of having just that one story to define an entire population of people in this country. And so I want to talk to you about the behavioral science of the model minority myth and how that affects each of us, whether we're crazy rich Asians or crazy broke Asians. But before I get there, I'll tell you my actual story to set the stage. And so, I was also born in the South, rural Georgia, like buckle of the Bible Belt kind of situation. And, you know, church on every street corner, cows, pastures, a lot of forests where the Ku Klux Klan would secretly hold rituals at midnight. I wish I was kidding, I'm not. My friends ran into them in the forest. And so it was that kind of environment. And at the age of 2.5, I was enrolled in this school that turned out to be a Christian fundamentalist institution where for the next 10 years, I learned that 1, white people saved America, 2, that the earth is only 6,000 years old, and 3, evolution is a lie. And so that was my life. And this week I actually discovered there are documentaries on BBC about these kinds of schools I just discovered, so if you're interested, you can go and Google that. But this is all to say that, as you can imagine, there weren't a lot of Asian Americans in that area. And so growing up in that environment was really tough. I mean, looking back, I faced everything from microaggressions to having my physical safety in jeopardy. I had neighbors defile my home. I've been physically kicked in the head. And, you know, the kinds of stories that's not really sexy to talk about in the context of Asian Americans and the model minority myth. But these things happened, and it was really tough. And being in that environment, I actually, for about a decade of my childhood, just couldn't speak out in social settings. I struggled for 10 years with selective mutism, which is the same condition that Maya Angelou writes about, and I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, because of just the extreme stress and trauma of that environment. And so, during those 10 years, I had a lot of time to observe my surroundings, observe school, society around me. And one of the things that I realized was that even for my worst aggressors, I couldn't bring myself to hate them. I couldn't bring myself to dehumanize them the way that they were doing to me, because I was seeing this 360 life view about them. I mean, they had friends and family that they cared for, that they helped when they needed support. They would go to church, they were proclaimed Christians. I mean, the same boy who would gang up in the middle of class with a group of boys and talk about, you know, just chant about how much they hated Asians and Jews. The same boy who, that very same weekend, would go home to his neighborhood, take out his BB gun, chase down another Asian American girl in his neighborhood and shoot her. The same boy was also the one who I saw helping his friends when they were in need, who I saw was happy and sad, and who went to Sunday school on Sundays and was a proclaimed Christian. And could say he's a hypocrite, definitely was. But but at the end of it all, the thing that I was seeing was that we're just all human, and it was just so befuddling to me how these people who weren't necessarily fully evil could do such terrible things and justify it to themselves and still think that they're good people. Because one of the universal truths about any kind of racism or discrimination is that the people who are the aggressors don't actually think of themselves as racists. They think that they're good people. And so how could that be possible? And on the other side of the coin, while I was facing this struggle of basically having no power, I lived a bit of a parallel life in that I ghost rode as a middle-aged man to sell concrete cutting saws on eBay. So what my dad did, and as a 12-year-old girl, I would pretend to be a middle-aged man overriding and handle business negotiations and sell concrete cutting saws to these white male construction workers who were also in their middle ages. And what I realized was that as long as their perception of me matched their expectations, I could do business. And so, as I jumped back and forth between these two worlds, one in which I had power and one in which I completely did not, what I realized was that perception is absolutely key. And one of the most fundamental, core, frustrating things, but also one of the most fascinating things about our lives is that you can do and say the same things, but the results of that is going to largely depend on people's perceptions of you. And so let's hone in on that idea, their perception, and really break it down. What is it about society's perception of Asian Americans that allows these things to happen? And so now I'm a behavioral scientist in industry, and I spend my time designing and conducting experiments to figure out, one, why people do what they do, and two, develop tools to help people change their behavior to improve their decisions. And along the way, I learned some very interesting surprises about how the model minority myth affects Asian Americans. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So, bridging it back to the 20 people that we hypothetically pulled aside out on the street. If you asked any of them to guess my life background story, I'm pretty sure none of them would have gotten anywhere too close. And it's not really their fault. It's like the one main narrative that runs the discourse of Asian Americans in society. But what the model minority myth does is that it basically boils down to the psychology of impressions. And evolutionarily, people are wired to basically immediately tag everyone they meet for the first time as friend or foe, and this happens on a subconscious level. And there are two dimensions that exist for that. There's warmth and there's competence. And those two dimensions actually work almost in a zero-sum game. And so what happens is that if you perceive somebody to be less or more warm, they're seen as less competent. But when they're seen as more competent, they're seen as less warm, less likable, less sociable. In other words, they're seen as competition. And so 17 years ago, researchers at Princeton ran a psychology study to see how this warmth and competence paradox interacted with stereotypes about people's races. And what they found was that for groups such as Asian Americans and Jewish people, because they were seen as highly competent, they were also seen as less warm, less sociable. In fact, they were seen as too hardworking, too ambitious, too competent, and at the same time less sociable, less desirable, less likable, less warm. And in other words, they were just seen as competition, which then ties into the emotion of envy. And so the main point that's interesting for us in this context out of this study is that society is psychologically wired to empathize less with Asian Americans. And because when we're seen as competition, it evokes feelings of envy, and that's how, on a subconscious level, people are essentially able to justify the actions that they do against us. And so this is a perfect psychological breeding grounds for dehumanization. And if you look back in history, especially during the Holocaust, and look at the rhetoric that Germany was using to rally the country against Jews, a lot of the rhetoric was about how they were fearfully competent, how they were portrayed as very self-serving, very cold. And if this seems a little too extreme in the context of Asian Americans, it's actually surprisingly relevant to us, because the reason that Asian Americans were imprisoned in internment camps during World War II, and the fact that history can just easily gloss over that is directly a result of these perceptions working together. And so it also affects us, affects underprivileged Asian Americans to a different degree as well, in that because Asian Americans are portrayed as unlikable competitors, Asian Americans have the highest poverty rates in New York City, but nobody realizes. And when it comes to having jobs and job searches, when you look at unemployment rates, for example, at first glance it looks okay, but then you dig into the details and you look at long-term unemployment rates. And what you find is that actually Asian Americans make up the majority of that pool as compared to white, black, and Hispanic workers. And of all Asian Americans who are unemployed, half of them fall under long-term unemployment. And so I'm going to just throw two more stats at you. 75% of those people are foreign-born, and 35% of them have struggles with speaking English. And now when you think about language and the way that that ties into stereotypes and perceptions, just having an Asian accent is something that can seep into how society acts around you. So for example, sociolinguists ran an experiment where they basically got people randomized into different groups, and they were all listening in on the same job interviews. And these interviews were the same in terms of content, they were the same in terms of grammar, everything. The only difference between these groups was that some were in an American Midwestern accent, some were in a British accent, and the other was in a Japanese accent. And what this study found is that the stronger the Japanese accent, the less their scores were, the people that they gave them on measures of sociability, likability, warmth, so on and so forth. And so, with all of that said, what can we do as Asian Americans in a society that's psychologically wired to empathize less with us? What can we do in a society that basically dismisses the discrimination that Asian Americans face as a case of hurt feelings? Well, part of the answer, and I think a large part of the answer, is exactly what we're doing here today, right now, which is sharing our stories and speaking up. And if a girl who couldn't speak at all in social settings for 10 years can do this, then I'm definitely sure you all can as well, and I hope you do. Thank you.